Can you believe that it's been almost 20 years since 9/11? The 20th anniversary of 9/11 is coming up in just a few days. At least for me, it feels like 9/11 happened just yesterday. In preparation for the 20th anniversary, National Geographic, the National Geographic Channel, has been doing this documentary telling stories, interviews of 9/11 and showing images from that day, many images and stories I had never seen or heard before. As I've been watching that documentary, the feelings of that day just come rushing back in. All the horror and the heartache just comes rushing back in. There's some stories that I never heard before. I don't know if they haven't been told before or just that I missed them, but there's some really compelling stories, heartbreaking stories that I've never heard before. One of the most compelling and heartbreaking is this businessman who is American, but he was Irish born. So he's this thick, heavy brogue, this heavy Irish accent. And in the interview, he tells a story of how that day he was supposed to have this really important business meeting. It was supposed to take place in Midtown, a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. So before that day, he went out and bought this beautiful new suit and this yellow tie that he was very proud of in order to make a good impression during this meeting. That morning at 6 a.m., he got a phone call telling him that the meeting site had been moved. It had been moved from Midtown, the hotel in Midtown, to the Marriott that stood right by the Trade Center, kind of kitty-cornered the Trade Center at the foot of the two towers. So he makes his way across the Hudson on the Staten Island ferry. He comes across on the ferry. When he gets off the ferry, a man comes up to him and compliments him on his suit, especially his tie. So he's feeling really good about the day. He's feeling like this business meeting is going to go well. It has to go well. He's nervous about it. And he has a little time before the meeting starts. So when he gets to the Trade Center, he goes into the first floor lobby of the North Tower because he always loved those tree of life windows. In the first floor lobby, they kind of bowed out to form this tree of life image. So he walks around kind of to calm himself, to get himself in the right frame of mind, gazing at, contemplating the tree of life windows. It's at that moment that the first plane hits the North Tower. And if you remember what happened, when the plane hits the tower, all its jet fuel goes down through the elevator shaft and blows out the first floor. There's about 20 or 30 people just waiting for the elevator, waiting to get on the elevator. That jet fuel ignites and incinerates most of them, kills most of them right on the spot. One of the people that survived that initial explosion is a woman who was very badly burned. As this man is trying to figure out what's going on, what just happened, he's running through the lobby, he encounters this woman. He sees her badly burned, and she can't see because her eyes actually have been burned shut. So he goes up to her and tries to help her, to give her assistance, to help her out of the tower. And then, if you remember, there's all kinds of debris falling, so you can't just walk out of the tower and up the street and get away from it. They had to find a point of refuge. So he tries to find her a point of refuge and starts calling for EMS, calling for help. Obviously, no help was coming right away because of the chaos. A couple other people join him and start to try to help this woman, and she's in really bad shape. They're sitting with her for a while, and he says that her clothes were just burned to her skin. Eventually, after being there for about 45 minutes, she starts to get really panicky. She starts to ask him, am I going to die? Am I going to make it through this? And then she starts uttering a prayer. She says, Sacred Heart of Jesus, let me live. Please don't let me die here today. When he hears that, this man says to her, he says, are you Catholic? And she says, yes. She says, would you like to pray the Lord's Prayer? He's fearing that she might actually be dying, but he also wants to calm her down. And he figures by saying the Lord's Prayer, it will calm her down and also prepare her in case she is dying. So together, they say the Lord's Prayer. While they're saying the Lord's Prayer together, that's when the second plane hits the other tower. Eventually, there's a lot more to his story, but eventually he along with a few gentlemen, are able to take her and get her across to the West Side highway where there's ambulances waiting, and they get her to the hospital to save her. She, from what I understand, she lives, she survives that day. But after he leaves her at an ambulance, he just wants to forget the horror of what he's just experienced. And so he starts walking with all the other people that are trying to walk out of Lower Manhattan. If you remember some of those images, people walking up the highway just to get away from Lower Manhattan. He starts walking up the highway, longing to be able to just take a shower and forget all the things that he'd just seen. He just wanted, as he says in the interview, he says, I just wanted to take a hot shower and forget what I had just seen, what I had just experienced. But as he's walking up the West Side Highway, he gets a phone call from his brother, and they go back and forth a little bit, but eventually in the phone call, what they figure out is his brother tells him, your brother-in-law tells him, your sister, and which is his brother-in-law's wife, and her little daughter, he had a young niece, they were on that second plane that hit the second tower. At the moment this man is saying the Lord's Prayer, his sister and his little niece are being killed in that second plane hitting the second tower. The stories of 9/11 are absolutely heart-wrenching. But if there's something that 9/11 taught us, if there's some things that 9/11 made very clear that it would always be helpful for us to remember, and if we're honest, as much as we said we would never forget, we've for the most part forgotten. Our culture 20 years later has forgotten these lessons of 9/11. But if there are some lessons that 9/11 can teach us, I think there are three things that we would do so well to remember. First, in the wake of 9/11, nobody doubted the reality of evil. Evil was ever present in that event. And watching the evil that unfolded in front of our faces made us realize that we're not living in this kind of just neutral world. There's a cosmic battle taking place, a battle between good and evil, a battle for our souls. And we are deciding every day, every moment of our lives, which side we're going to be on. Even in the little decisions that we make and how we treat one another, we're deciding which side to take. Nobody questioned the reality of evil in the wake of 9/11. Nobody could. It would be an insult to question what happened as being anything but evil, horrific, horrendous, terrible evil. But here's the good news. The good news is that the only way there can be a reality called evil is if there's a reality called good. The only way that there can be a cosmic battle of good versus evil is if we live in a moral universe. The only way we can be living in a moral universe is if there is a God, a good God, a God who, yes, gives us freedom, and in that freedom allows us to do horrific things, but a God whose goodness ultimately wins out in the end. And the second lesson that 9/11 taught us is, you think about the images, one of the firefighters, a seasoned firefighter, he was the driver of the chief, the first chief to respond. If you remember the videos, there's the video where they're at a gas leak and they see the first plane hit the building, they go charging towards the building. Both of them miraculously survived. He talks about being in situations in other fires where he was scared for his life, he thought he was going to die. But on 9/11, this seasoned firefighter who has experienced moments where he had to make decisions about whether he was going to live or die, or thought he might die by fire or by having to jump out of a building. He talks about the most heartbreaking thing, the thing that has stuck with him all these years, is looking up at those poor people hanging out windows of the towers who they couldn't rescue, they couldn't get to, who had made the horrific decision of either burning to death or jumping from the tower. They knew in that moment they were going to die. It was just a matter of how. And these poor people, just a few minutes earlier, they were just going to work. They had important meetings they were going to. They were doing paperwork. They were taking care of business on an ordinary day. They had pictures of their family on their desks. And in a few minutes, just a few minutes later, they're making a decision about how they're going to die that day. If 9/11 reminds us of anything, it's our mortality. It's the fact that we aren't going to be here forever, that we should live every moment to the fullest, that we should take advantage of every moment to make that choice for good for the people around us, to live our lives for those around us, for love of them. Because in the end, that's all that mattered. That's all that those people cared about in those last moments. When they made their phone calls, there's some heartbreaking messages in that documentary where they just want people to know how much they love them. There's one where a father calls his wife and begins the message by saying, whatever you do, save this message for forever. Don't let anything happen to this message, because he knows that's the last words he's ever going to say to his wife and to his daughter. The third thing that 9/11 teaches us is that in the midst of it, God is always with us. That's the whole point of the cross. I don't know if you remember this. I don't know if it was a sign from God. I don't know if God orchestrated this, but in the rubble, the debris that day, towards the end of the day, as the firefighters are starting to pick through the pile, the steel formed a cross. There were two cross I-beams from the towers that formed a cross. And at least for some of the people there, they saw it as a sign that God was with them, that in this horrific moment, this moment of incredible evil, God hadn't abandoned them. That, whether or not God orchestrated it, it is a sign of the reality of what Christianity teaches, of what Jesus is all about. We have a God who suffers with us, who is with us in the midst of our worst suffering. We are never alone in those moments. And one of the things that reinforce that his goodness hasn't abandoned us, even in the midst of the worst of tragedies, is the kind of heroism we saw in the midst of that tragedy. There's another story that I've never heard before. I know of this firefighter, Michael Jonas. He was the captain of Ladder 6. He's one of the few firefighters that actually survived the collapse. When the tower collapsed, they were in the core about 4 to 6 stories up. That inner core that remained intact, and they were trapped for a while, for several hours, and they had to have some firefighters come get them. But he tells the story of how when they were in the lobby, he saw some of his friends. He'd been on the fire department for many years. He sees some of his friends, these seasoned firefighters, elite firefighters from a rescue company. And he goes over to them, and they start talking, and they say, we may not survive this day. They knew that there was a good chance they weren't going to live through that experience. And they start shaking hands, and they say, it's been a pleasure knowing you. If we don't make this, it's a pleasure knowing you. It's been a pleasure working with you. And then they went right up those stairs to rescue people. They didn't hesitate, knowing that there was a good chance they were going to die. They gave their lives in order to save people. The God of the universe did the exact same thing. There's nothing more beautiful than somebody who's willing to lay down their life for somebody else. The Lord of the universe has done that for us. And as much as 9/11 was just a moment of pure evil, pure horror, pure heartbreak, one thing it reminds us that we can cling to, that we can always be assured of, is that we can never be separated from the love of a God who would be willing to lay his life down for us. When we saw that heroism on 9/11, we can be sure that that's how God looks at us, that God does everything that he possibly could for us in laying down his life to save us. And even though 20 years later, those feelings from 9/11 can come rushing, at least for me, come rushing back in, the horror of that day, we can live in the hope of a God whose love will never, ever abandon us. As you celebrate this 20th anniversary, I hope that you take some time to reflect. I hope that you will never forget that day, because as bad as that day was, the lessons of that day are life transforming, are what it's all about. Focus us on what we're supposed to be as human beings. May God bless you, and may you know that he will never, ever abandon you.